We have access on a daily basis to senior leaders and to, I guess, influential decision makers who can make changes in the hiring structure and what they're doing.
Over the last couple of years, we've made sure that as a business, our culture and the service that we offer is a representation of what we want to see in society. So we will be talking to these senior leaders about some of the challenges and getting into detail around some of the initiatives that have been successful and worked for them.
What we really would like to do is kind of normalise the conversation and get people comfortable with having conversations around diversity and inclusion.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining the DEI Bucket List podcast today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be invited, and I look forward to sharing insights.
Thank you so much. Do you want to kick off by just sharing a bit of background about yourself?
Yes. So I like to say there is a thread of diversity through my entire career. I started off as a public finance banker, focusing on low and moderate income housing. And I have specialized in DEI for 20 years. So well before it was a critical focus. So I've served as global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for 3 financial service firms, 1 tech company, and I'm currently working with Jennifer Brown Consulting. And I'm able to have so much more impact in terms of working across industries, organizations of all sizes that are really focused right now on creating that inclusive environment and making change in the world.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for joining us. We're really grateful and we're looking forward to hearing what you're going to share. So as you and I have talked about, obviously these sessions are really to help provide insights and snapshots to other businesses and other people within the D&I space who might just need somewhere to go to for a sounding board, just to get some advice from someone such as yourself with such great experience in this space. So if okay with you, I'll kick off with question number 1.
Yes.
What approaches or specific interventions would you suggest for companies interested in diversifying their talent pipelines and hiring?
Yeah, so before jumping into that question, I'll just underscore a couple key points. So I think oftentimes people want to start with recruiting first, but the one bit of guidance that I always share is, look at your internal culture, right? Is it truly a welcoming environment? Because otherwise, if you just focus on your recruiting approaches, but don't have the internal ecosystem right, it will become a revolving door, right? So doing that upfront DEI assessment is so critical and really taking that long-term investment. So in terms of critical key approaches, I would say start with the data, right? Understand where your pipeline might be leaking so that you could hone in on that component in terms of the recruiting cycle. And the other thing, and I think this comes from having a business background, is understand what your current state is, know what your desired state is, and be really clear in terms of defining, goals and objectives. So if you have targets, make sure they're grounded in the business reality, right? Some businesses may be growing at a faster clip than others. And so you'll be able to leverage recruiting in those instances versus other businesses that might be in steady state or retrenchment mode. So I think, ground it in the business reality. And I always like to say, keep it real, right? Candidates these days, especially as you think about Gen Z entering the workforce, they want to work for an organization that aligns with their values, has a sense of purpose. So as you think about, really think about and be intentional between your candidate value proposition and your employee value proposition. Our oldest son is a Gen Z, and so he always is sharing memes of different employers. And so there is a very active and transparent arena out there in terms of different organizations. So be intentional in terms of the brand. And for me, it's always about equity and access, right? And really think through how are you providing access? So I think back to the 1990s when we started the first fellowship and scholarship programs for underrepresented individuals because they didn't have access to financial service as much at the time. And so really, just think through and be more open-minded in your approaches.
Amazing, thank you. That's really helpful. And then you're kind of saying, obviously, there's a difference between like an approach and then a specific intervention, and obviously what you can do to introduce in the workplace to, I think, differentiate between those and obviously then bring those to life. What's your thoughts around those?
Yeah, well, as you think about interventions, it's interesting when you think about what we're trying to overcome, right? There's natural affinity bias, especially in the recruiting process. And so I kind of come back to that intentionality. You need to be intentional about disrupting biases, mindsets, and just past practices. So I like to say I'm a bias buster and an inclusion alchemist. And really thinking about the whole recruiting cycle, right? So starting with attraction. How can you make your job descriptions more appealing, right? Include more inclusive language. And there are a lot of you can leverage technology, whether it's gender decoder or Textio, right? So think about how you can appeal to a broader swath of candidates. And I love the 60% study that talks about how women will only apply to roles if they have 100% of the criteria. Yeah. Men will, if they have 60%, I would suggest they only have 30%. Anyway, I saw a fascinating, I call it a behavior nudge at the bottom of a job description. I'm wishing I could remember which company, but it basically referenced the 60% study and encourage all underrepresented individuals to all talent really to apply. But again, it was a behavioral inclusion nudge in that science and that research. So I think just be creative. And then activate your network. So I remember at one of the financial service companies, we had a real challenge on the trading floor in terms of having women in P&L roles. So we activated our different employee resource groups. And most recently at the tech company, we created something called a talent ambassadors network, right? We want to tap a talent ambassadors program. We want to tap into our own network, and that's a way you can disrupt the affinity bias that oftentimes happens with employee referral programs. Yes, so think about at the attraction stage, and then at the sourcing stage. Again, it goes back to just being creative, and I say meet candidates where they are. So one of the things that at the most recent tech company, we developed a diversity recruiting toolkit. And we list all sorts of different sources. So you could partner with alumni groups at Black fraternities or sororities. Maybe there are faith-based organizations. Again, when it comes back to recruiting early career talent and Gen Z, right? You want to do coffee cafes or something that just will allow you to outreach and source candidates in a way that you perhaps haven't done historically. And then for organizations which are perhaps a little bit bigger in size and have the recruiting infrastructure, I recommend having I'm going to call it a dedicated sourcer. At one organization, the person was called the female sniper, right? Because her role was to proactively develop relationships with all female candidates so that we can ensure that we have a robust pipeline, right? We want to combat the lame excuse, well, there aren't any qualified candidates out there. So I think that could be a creative way to combat that and to do it again in that very intentional way. Another intervention we found is requiring roles be open for a certain period of time, right? I don't know how many times people have come to me and said, oh, I met this guy on the golf course this weekend. I think he'd be a great culture fit. How quickly can we get him an offer? Right. And so we need to disrupt, again, there's that affinity bias kicking in, right? So we disrupt that. So at one organization, we required roles be open for a period of 20 days. And again, the research shows that for women and other underrepresented groups, you have to cultivate that relationship. So I know many organizations have talent communities, but again, keeping the roles open for a specified period of time was another way to disrupt that bias. You'll get pushback at first, but when they see the results, it will they will be, and when they understand the rationale, it will be more rewarding. So those would be a couple, as I think about attraction, sourcing. Obviously, with the interviewing process, a lot of people have introduced candidate slates, akin to the Rooney Rule, or as you think about the Mansfield Rule from the law firm. And then, looking at focusing, I like to call it the 70-30 approach. So hire for potential, right? Somebody might have 70% of the qualifications, but can you train for the other 30%? And especially now with the war for talent, I think companies are, again, this goes back to opening your mindset a little bit more, and training the hiring managers to and then having the requisite training programs, right, so that people can really succeed. And then the last thing I would suggest is just from a process enhancement. I remember back with when I used to head up campus recruiting, we would assign a buddy to underrepresented talent, really to help them navigate, right? What are some of the unwritten rules within your organization, and help them understand, key qualities for success. And we found that just by this simple process intervention, that we increase the success rate and the flow through rate, right, from just applicant to interview to offer to then hire with our underrepresented talent. So I would, those would be some of the specific interventions, at each stage of the recruiting cycle that I would recommend.
Because that then obviously creates for you, obviously like an opportunity to create I'm thinking of this as you're going through it, and it creates that kind of cyclical pattern, whereas actually if you're creating this, your affinity bias will be more of the minority groups that you've got involved in the business, and then hopefully, I know that's more of it's a longer term process, but I think anything around this really is you can't really be reactive when it comes to
I like to say create that virtuous circle instead of that vicious circle, right? Because there's a famous quote: if you continue doing the same things and expect different outcomes, right? And so the last thing though, I think it needs to be business owned and led. Oftentimes, especially with recruiting, so many organizations rely on the talent acquisition team, and it becomes the HR default, right? So I think it's also equipping hiring managers with tools and insights, and that's where the diversity recruiting toolkit comes in, right? Have a very specific focus for hiring managers, and then have targets, right? And segment those targets. So you can be bolder with your interns in early career, maybe set a 50% target when it comes to gender, and then again, look at what the demographics are for underrepresented talent, and be bold and underscore the critical role and responsibility that hiring managers have. I think that's part of that virtuous cycle and circle.
And the education piece for it to come outside of talent, I imagine, right? It's not just talent's focus, it's the whole business focus. And when the whole team can get on board with that and actually realize what impact it will have for them in the business and how important it is, I think hopefully, again, that cycle is created for each team and not just within the talent cycle.
Yeah, well, yes, there's carryover when you think about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion overall. And also, I would say, partnering with Annapurna and other organizations, really think about what are those strategic partnerships, right? Especially if you're a smaller organization, maybe you don't have a large internal recruiting team, but make diversity, equity, and inclusion, integrate that, right? So as you're thinking about your service level agreements with external recruiters, and just keep it at the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we've been trying to do more of, and just making sure that we're doing that ourselves, obviously practicing what we preach in that sense. But yeah, hopefully more and more people will join in on that. I think hopefully we're slowly getting there, I think.
Yes, well, especially over the last 18 months, what I have observed, again, as I think about my 20 years focusing on DEI, is companies now are willing to lean into the conversations and do the hard work and really invest. And I think they recognize you can't just chase the shiny new object, right? Whether it's unconscious bias training for hiring managers, you really need to take that data informed and that systemic systems lens, right, to thinking about this, and as I said, just being a little bit more creative, and mind you, some of these interventions, they don't cost money. I mean, yes, it's time, so that time is an investment, but I think you can be more strategic in terms of how you're thinking about this. So I don't want people to feel that you need to have $1 million budget, but I am seeing, especially over the last 18 months, organizations really willing to focus on this in a critical way. So that's encouraging. There's hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, and it's a shame that it's been kind of led by unfortunate worldly events, of course, but at the same time, these people are now speaking out a lot more, which is what we want. It starts people at least moving into action, which is obviously great, and I'm glad that we're getting there as a society, for sure.
Yes.
I guess that leads us into this question quite well. And so what mindset shifts need to occur to lead to different outcomes? And what silver linings have you seen resulting from the pivot to remote work during COVID? Should we start with the first one first? So the mindset shifts that need to occur.
Yes. So remember that I said I worked the majority of my career in financial services, right? And that was very much an in-the-office culture. You need to physically be present. Some could say a little bit of a FaceTime culture. And it was amazing how literally in the course of a week or 2 weeks, everybody was working from home. So I really think the pandemic has presented just an opportune time for this paradigm shift, right? People have seen that it is possible, and that people, well, actually, interestingly, especially in the early days of the pandemic, companies were finding that people were spending on average 2 to 3 hours more per day working, right? Yeah. So it's almost, more of a concern in terms of is everyone going to burn out? And now people are able to really question where roles can be based, right? How work gets done. And I think that hiring managers have seen the proof that it can be done. And in fact, in some instances, as I mentioned, it has led to greater productivity. But my concern is that, we're not quite in a post-pandemic world, but as people are returning to office, we need to be very, again, intentional in terms of reminding people that these roles can be based elsewhere. So as a recruiter is doing an intake with a hiring manager, I think we need to empower our recruiters to push back a little bit more, right? And now they're armed with the data. They've seen where and how it has worked so effectively. And then there are tools that you can use to find out where the biggest pockets of underrepresented talent is, and then you can be, again, more strategic. Not all organizations will go to a fully remote workforce, and I totally recognize that, but I think it's striking that balance, focusing on the absolute necessary skills, again, this comes back to tightening your job descriptions. And I do think there is a silver lining as we think about, what this new world of work will look like and how people will operate. But it does come back to resisting the natural tendency of people to revert back to their old ways.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said at the beginning as well about just people getting a little bit more creative. And I think now we have the flexibility to host, you could host multiple interviews, like your assessment days via Zoom and over a conference call. And actually, we probably never would have even thought of doing that before, but there are so many different avenues that you can take now, and then you can have more and more access to that. Obviously, you don't have the time consumption of going to and from an office, so you could actually probably do more assessment days in one day than perhaps you would have before. So okay, I can see X amount more talent today. Why don't we do it that way and hire based on who we then see as potential for fitting the role, a bit like what you just mentioned, rather than actually just saying, oh no, they need X, Y, and Z, which obviously is where we've been before, isn't it? I think it's creativity.
And what are you seeing in terms of some of the mindset shifts as you're talking to clients and you're hearing? Are you seeing that in terms of where people are saying these roles need to be based? Are you seeing that broader perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone's kind of going to a remote first culture particularly in the tech environments. And obviously then they all have to compete with each other to source the best talent. So if one of them's doing it, most of them have to do it, and they all tend to follow suit. But that obviously just naturally opens up a much bigger pool. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because obviously then it means, well, actually there's probably too big of a pool to play in, and it makes it quite difficult to go fishing, so to speak. But at the same time, obviously that's a very good problem to have. That's what we want. So actually, okay, let's utilize this and see what we can do. And we're seeing a lot of the tech firms now that are bringing in people from similar industries or similar types of roles, but actually then training them to help them move into tech, which obviously then just expands that pool so much.
That's exactly the 70-30 I was talking about. I saw a tech company recently put out a statement, a very bold statement, that it was this whole complete flex work. And in big bold letters, the first bullet said, work wherever you are, whatever times, no manager dictate, right? So really addressing that head on. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, well, that's an organization that a lot of that will be a talent magnet for people. And so even within the flex work, I think you need to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. And then I would just say, obviously, thank you so much for this. It's really helpful. I think there's lots there that people are going to resonate with, and hopefully you'll have some takeaways from. And particularly the data piece and understanding where the gaps are. I think that's a very good takeaway for people. I would just say, what are the recommendations or insights would you like to share, Elizabeth?
One thing that I should have underscored earlier is when you're looking at the data, really look at things through that intersectional lens, right? So we know that underrepresented women, for instance, will have a different set of barriers and biases to overcome, and may have a different experience in the workplace. So when you're looking at the data, look at, splice and dice. So you're really looking at that through an intersectional lens, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, people with disabilities. And I would say also, think about, to your fishing analogy, think about fishing in different ponds, right? So, globally, 1 in 4 individuals is a person with a disability, right? That's 25% of our population globally. And I think that many organizations don't fully appreciate, right, whether that's individuals who are neurodiverse or just diversity more broadly. And just on a personal note, we have 4 children, 3 of whom have mild disabilities. And again, I think if workplaces understand the gifts that many of those individuals bring to the workplace and can tap in there, and measure your progress. So yes, take a long run view, but you need to identify some quick wins along the way, right? To keep the momentum, to keep people engaged. And especially if you're a global organization, you may not need to roll out a big intervention globally, but you can develop a proof of concept in one business area and then scale it, right? Recalibrate, continue to try new things. So if one intervention doesn't work, really understand why. And then the last thing I would say is, as you're thinking about your recruiting cycle, and this kind of goes back to how I opened, really think about the full employee life cycle. So as we're, especially in a virtual world, as we're onboarding people virtually, we need to think differently about the employee experience, right? How do you cultivate that sense of belonging? And I do think this is where an organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, their holistic strategy plays a critical role. And then, look at what are the throughputs as you look at retention and, the quality of candidate that you're hiring, right? How are they contributing to the business and to your organization? So I'm excited for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think we will have both many new challenges, but many new opportunities and ways to be creative and intentional. And as I say, just, developing new mindsets and new practices that will allow us all to grow.
Absolutely. I think obviously the newest generation coming through will hopefully have the most opportunity to really try and change things in the workplace. So hopefully if we're attracting them soon enough, that will certainly impact businesses earlier on, and then obviously naturally that will create more diverse talent pools quicker than it does take. It does take a long time, I think, like you're quite right.
Yeah. I learn every day. So we 2 of our 4 children are now in the workplace, and so I get tremendous insights from them in terms of what is important, and we are seeing more advocacy in the workplace. So again, that kind of goes back to making sure, keep it real, right? What, define, it's so critical for organizations to define what they stand for and then be able to communicate that in more compelling ways. I think, the power of storytelling. The other thing I would suggest is, and this kind of goes back to activating your network, ensure that you're lifting the voices of all of your talent, right? At one of the companies, we had a blog where we would very deliberately profile employees to tell their story and talk about their experience, and then share that on our career site so that people could get a real sense. So I think there's an opportunity, this would be another recommendation for people to enhance their external facing career site, but with current employee, real testimonials.
Real life, yeah.
Stories, just make it come alive. So, it's interesting times and exciting times. And again, I've specialized in DEI for 20 years. I'm really looking forward to what the next 20 years will bring.
Amazing, thank you so much. And as you know, this is our DEI Bucket List series. So is there anything on your bucket list that you'd like to share with us today?
Yes, well, I have 2 bucket list items. So we, like many people during the pandemic, acquired a puppy. So I guess my short bucket list is to be a puppy trainer. I feel that's, I should be on my CV. But then in all seriousness, I just love exploring different cultures. I can't wait until we can travel more. I would love to just get in an RV and drive across country, right? Stopping, meeting people along the way, learning about, whether it's different national parks, different people. And I would really love to take one of those amazing safari trips. People who've done that have just said that has been life altering. So I specifically want to go to Botswana, Tanzania. So that's really on my bucket list when everything opens up again.
Amazing. I've been to Tanzania. I've done a safari and climbed Kilimanjaro, and I highly, highly recommend putting that on the bucket list. It's
okay,
amazing.
so I need to escalate that, right?
You do, when you're able to travel, 100%.
You're on that priority list. Well, I will be tapping into you then. Well, I don't know that I'll climb Mount Kilimanjaro necessarily, but I will tap into the rest of your itinerary.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Really, really helpful, and I'm so grateful to have you on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Hopefully today was, kind of a balance, threading the needle between being inspirational but very practical in terms of, some ideas that companies can implement and help us all move the needle.
That's perfect. And I hope you enjoy your 4th of July weekend.
I will. I am planting my 3rd victory garden. Here in the US, we have a significant drought. And so everyone's concerned about being able to get enough fresh produce. So I have several different gardens already planted, and I'm going to be planting cucumbers, squash, and a whole host of other things. So I don't have to worry about whether or not I can get green produce at the grocery store.
That's amazing. Well, have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.
All right. Be well.
Thank you. You too.